In the rugged plains of Montana, nestled between towering mountains and endless skies, stood a modest cattle ranch that few would give a second glance. Its owner, James "Jim" Cooper, was known throughout Thunder Valley as a hard-working rancher who kept to himself, tending his herd with quiet dedication. But the local troublemakers who decided to target his land would soon discover that behind his weathered hands and peaceful demeanor lay a deadly set of skills from his classified past in special forces, skills he had hoped never to use again. Morning. Light spilled across the vast expanse of Thunder Valley Ranch, painting the Montana landscape in hues of gold and amber. The crisp mountain air carried the familiar scents of sage and prairie grass, mingling with the earthy aroma of cattle and fresh hay. Jim Cooper stood at the edge of his property, his calloused hands resting on the wooden fence post as he surveyed his land with eyes that missed nothing. The ranch wasn't the biggest in the valley, but it was his, every acre earned through years of back-breaking work and careful planning. The modest two-story farmhouse, weathered barn, and stretching pastures represented everything he'd worked for since leaving his old life behind. At 52, Jim's face carried the marks of both time and hardship, deep lines etched around eyes that had seen more than most could imagine. His daily routine was as predictable as the sunrise. Up before dawn, Jim would make his rounds, checking on the cattle, mending any broken fences, and ensuring the irrigation systems were running smoothly. The work was honest and straightforward, everything his previous life hadn't been. He found peace in the simplicity of it all, the rhythmic movement of the horses beneath him as he rode the fence lines, the satisfied grunt of cattle as they grazed on the lush Montana grass. The local community had embraced Jim when he'd first arrived 5 years ago, though he kept largely to himself. They knew him as the quiet rancher who always lent a helping hand during branding season, who'd stop whatever he was doing to help a neighbor with a broken-down tractor or a stuck calf. His presence at the Thunder Valley Diner every Sunday morning was as reliable as church bells, where he'd sit at the counter, drinking black coffee and exchanging pleasant but brief conversations with the locals. Sarah, the diner's owner, had taken a particular liking to Jim. She'd lost her husband in Afghanistan years ago, and something about Jim's reserved nature reminded her of the military men she'd known. She never pressed him about his past, but she noticed the way he always sat with his back to the wall, how his eyes would occasionally scan the room with an alertness that seemed out of place in their sleepy valley. "More coffee, Jim?" Sarah would ask, already knowing his answer. The morning sun, streaming through the diner's windows, would catch the silver in his dark hair as he nodded, offering a small smile that never quite reached his eyes. The ranch hands who worked for Jim respected him immensely, though they couldn't quite put their finger on why. There was something in the way he carried himself, a quiet authority that commanded attention without seeking it. He was fair but firm, expecting the same level of dedication from others that he demanded of himself. Marcus, his head ranch hand, had worked with him since the beginning. A young local who'd grown up on his family's neighboring ranch, Marcus had learned more from Jim in 5 years than he had in all his previous years of ranching combined. Jim had a way of teaching that went beyond words. It was in his actions, his attention to detail, his unwavering patience. "Boss has got something about him," Marcus would tell the other hands. "Way he moves, way he thinks things through. Different from other ranchers I've known. The cattle operation wasn't huge, but it was efficient. Jim ran about 300 head of Black Angus, known throughout the region for their quality. He'd built his reputation on doing things right, never taking shortcuts, and treating both his animals and his people with respect. The veterinarians who visited the ranch often remarked on how well managed everything was, how calm the cattle remained, even during routine procedures. Sarah from the diner was one of the few people who seemed to understand something of what lay beneath Jim's quiet exterior. She recognized the signs, the way he'd tense at sudden movements, how his eyes would track anyone who entered the diner, the slight pause before he'd walk through any doorway. These were the same mannerisms she'd observed in her late husband and the other soldiers she'd known. "You remind me of Michael sometimes," she said one morning, refilling his coffee cup. "He had that same look about him when he came back from his first tour." Jim had merely nodded, offering no comment, but something in Sarah's understanding gaze told him she knew more than she let on. She never pushed, never asked the questions that surely burned in her mind. Instead, she'd simply leave him to his coffee and thoughts, a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding. The nightmares still came occasionally, though less frequently than before. On those nights, Jim would find himself in the barn, methodically cleaning tack that was already spotless or reorganizing tools that needed no organizing. The rhythmic work helped ground him, bringing him back to the present, away from the memories of operations gone wrong and brothers lost in battle. His training surfaced in unexpected ways. The way he planned his cattle drives showed the same tactical precision he'd once used in mission planning. His ability to read terrain, to anticipate problems before they arose, had saved more than one calf during difficult births. Even his approach to training horses drew on skills he'd learned in special forces: patience, clear communication, and the understanding that trust had to be earned. Marcus, his head ranch hand, had once asked him where he'd learned to handle himself so well in crisis situations. It had been during a particularly nasty spring storm when 3 heifers had gone into labor simultaneously. Jim's calm demeanor and quick decision-making had saved all 3 cows and their calves. Experience was all Jim had offered in response, but his mind had flashed to different kinds of crises in places far from the peaceful Montana Valley. The local sheriff, Dave Wilson, was perhaps the only person in Thunder Valley who knew anything concrete about Jim's past. As a matter of procedure, he'd run a background check when Jim first bought the ranch. What he'd found had been heavily redacted, but it was enough to tell him that the quiet rancher had once served his country in ways that couldn't be openly discussed. "Must have been quite a change," Dave had commented once during a chance meeting at the feed store, "going from what you used to do to raising cattle." Jim had fixed him with a steady gaze. "Some skills transfer better than you'd think, Sheriff." The conversation had ended there, but an understanding had been established. Dave kept an eye on the ranch when he could, not out of suspicion, but out of respect for a man who'd clearly sacrificed much in service to his country. The ranch itself bore subtle signs of Jim's military background. The layout of the buildings provided clear lines of sight in all directions. The access roads were positioned to prevent anyone from approaching unobserved. Even the way he'd organized his tools and equipment showed the influence of military efficiency. At night, when the work was done and the ranch grew quiet, Jim would often sit on his porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. These moments of solitude were when the weight of his past felt heaviest. The peaceful valley spread out before him was a far cry from the hostile territories he'd once navigated, but he never fully relaxed. Years of training and experience had taught him that peace was often fleeting, and trouble could find you even in the most unlikely places. He'd chosen Thunder Valley precisely because it was everything his former life wasn't: quiet, predictable, far from the chaos and violence he'd known. The ranch represented more than just a new career. It was his chance at redemption, a way to create something instead of destroying, to nurture life instead of taking it. But as Jim watched the gathering darkness, he couldn't shake the feeling that the peace he'd found might not last. Something in his gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive through countless operations, told him that change was coming. He just didn't know what form it would take, or how much it would test his resolve to leave his old life behind. The first sign of trouble came on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. Jim was checking the southeastern fence line, the spring, sun warm on his back as he rode his favorite quarter horse, Dakota, along the perimeter. The cattle had been acting strangely for the past few days, clustering away from this section of the property, and Jim wanted to know why. He first noticed the tire tracks, deep treads from heavy vehicles that had no business being on his land. They cut through the wet spring grass, leading toward the fence line. As Dakota moved closer, Jim's practiced eye caught sight of the damage. 3 fence posts had been deliberately knocked loose, the wire between them hanging slack. This wasn't normal wear and tear or weather damage. Someone had intentionally targeted his property. Jim dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth as he examined the damage more closely. The posts hadn't just been knocked over, they'd been pulled out with some kind of chain or rope. The wire showed signs of being cut in places rather than breaking naturally. His jaw tightened as he noticed empty beer cans scattered nearby, with cigarette butts that couldn't have been more than a day old. "What do you make of this, old girl?" he murmured to Dakota, who snorted softly in response. The horse's ears were pricked forward, alert to something Jim couldn't yet see or hear. He'd learned long ago to trust an animal's instincts. They often notice things humans missed. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the morning silence. Jim led Dakota behind a cluster of pine trees, his movements automatic, instinctive. Old habits died hard, and the impulse to observe without being seen was deeply ingrained. 2 pickup trucks appeared on the county road that ran parallel to his property line, moving slowly, as if their occupants were searching for something. Toshishu. Trucks were newer models, jacked up with oversized tires and dark-tinted windows, not the kind of vehicles typically used by local ranchers. They rolled to a stop near the damaged section of fence, and 4 men climbed out. Even from this distance, Jim could tell they weren't from Thunder Valley. Their body language, the way they moved and positioned themselves, spoke of people who were used to intimidating others. "This Cooper's place," one of them asked, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. He was tall and heavy-set, with a shock of red hair and a thick beard. The others called him Rex. "Yeah, this is it," another responded, lighting a cigarette. "Old man's got about 300 head of prime black Angus. Been causing problems for the boss's operation, selling to the same buyers, undercutting prices." Jim remained motionless, years of training allowing him to stay perfectly still as he observed the group. They moved with a kind of casual arrogance, confident that they were alone and unobserved. The way they checked their surroundings was amateur, missing obvious points of coverage, like the tree line where Jim stood. "Well, looks like our message didn't get through yet," Rex said, kicking at one of the downed fence posts. "Guess we'll have to be more direct. Cooper needs to understand that Thunder Valley has new players now. Either he plays by our rules, or he doesn't play at all." The men laughed, and Jim felt a familiar coldness settle over him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, not since his last deployment. The calm clarity that came with identifying a threat. These weren't just vandals or local troublemakers. They were organized, with a specific purpose in mind. "Boss wants this wrapped up quick," Rex continued, pulling something from his truck. Jim's eyes narrowed as he recognized the distinctive shape of a bolt cutter. "No sense waiting. Let's cut the fence every quarter mile or so. See how long it takes him to round up his cattle when they're scattered all over the county." The other men pulled tools from their trucks, more bolt cutters, chains, and what looked like spray paint. They were settling in for a morning of systematic destruction. Jim watched as they began working their way along his fence line, documenting their movements, their patterns, the way they coordinated with each other. One of them, younger than the others, seemed nervous. "What if someone comes along?" Rex laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the morning air. "That's what these are for." He patted something under his jacket, and Jim didn't need to see it to know what he meant. The implied threat was clear. They were armed and prepared for confrontation. Jim felt Dakota shift restlessly behind him, responding to the tension in his body. He placed a calming hand on the horse's neck, his mind already racing through scenarios and options. The tactical part of his brain, the part he'd tried to keep dormant for the past 5 years, was already analyzing angles of approach, cover positions, potential choke points. But this wasn't a combat zone, and these men, despite their obvious criminal intentions, weren't enemy combatants. This was Thunder Valley, where problems were supposed to be solved through civil channels. Jim had promised himself when he bought this ranch that he'd leave violence behind, that he'd find peaceful solutions to whatever challenges arose. As if to test that resolve, one of the men pulled out a can of spray paint and began writing on the nearest fence post. Even from his position, Jim could make out the crude threat being spelled out: sell or suffer. The morning sun continued to rise over Thunder Valley as Jim watched the men work their way along his fence line, methodically, destroying the boundary he'd so carefully maintained. Every cut of the wire, every toppled post, every spray-painted threat was a direct challenge to the peace he'd built here. But more than that, it was a warning of things to come. Jim waited until the trucks had moved further down the fence line before quietly mounting Dakota and turning back toward the ranch house. He had calls to make, starting with Sheriff Wilson, but as he rode, a part of him knew that law enforcement might not be enough to handle what was coming. These men, whoever they were working for, hadn't chosen his ranch at random. They were organized, funded, and clearly used to operating without fear of consequences. The peace of Thunder Valley was about to be tested, and with it, Jim's resolve to keep his past firmly in the past. The first sign of trouble came on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning. Jim was checking the southeastern fence line, the spring sun warm on his back as he rode his favorite quarter horse Dakota along the perimeter. The cattle had been acting strangely for the past few days, clustering away from this section of the property, and Jim wanted to know why. He first noticed the tire tracks, deep treads from heavy vehicles that had no business being on his land. They cut through the wet spring grass, leading toward the fence line. As Dakota moved closer, Jim's practiced eye caught sight of the damage. 3 fence posts had been deliberately knocked loose, the wire between them hanging slack. This wasn't normal wear and tear or weather damage. Someone had intentionally targeted his property. Jim dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth as he examined the damage more closely. The posts hadn't just been knocked over, they'd been pulled out with some kind of chain or rope. The wire showed signs of being cut in places rather than breaking naturally. His jaw tightened as he noticed empty beer cans scattered nearby, along with cigarette butts that couldn't have been more than a day old. "What do you make of this, old girl?" he murmured to Dakota, who snorted softly in response. The horse's ears were pricked forward, alert to something Jim couldn't yet see or hear. He'd learned long ago to trust an animal's instincts. They often noticed things humans missed. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the morning silence. Jim led Dakota behind a cluster of pine trees, his movements automatic, instinctive. Old habits died hard, and the impulse to observe without being seen was deeply ingrained. 2 pickup trucks appeared on the county road that ran parallel to his property line, moving slowly, as if their occupants were searching for something. The trucks were newer models, jacked up with oversized tires and dark-tinted windows, not the kind of vehicles typically used by local ranchers. They rolled to a stop near the damaged section of fence, and 4 men climbed out. Even from this distance, Jim could tell they weren't from Thunder Valley. Their body language, the way they moved and positioned themselves, spoke of people who were used to intimidating others. "This Cooper's place?" one of them asked, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. He was tall and heavy-set, with a shock of red hair and a thick beard. The others called him Rex. "Yeah, this is it," another responded, lighting a cigarette. Old man's got about 300 head of prime black Angus. Been causing problems for the boss's operation, selling to the same buyers, undercutting prices. Jim remained motionless, years of training allowing him to stay perfectly still as he observed the group. They moved with a kind of casual arrogance, confident that they were alone and unobserved. The way they checked their surroundings was amateur, missing obvious points of coverage like the tree line where Jim stood. "Well, looks like our message didn't get through yet," Rex said, kicking at one of the downed fence posts. "Guess we'll have to be more direct. Cooper needs to understand that Thunder Valley has new players now. Either he plays by our rules, or he doesn't play at all." The men laughed, and Jim felt a familiar coldness settle over him. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, not since his last deployment. The calm clarity that came with identifying a threat. These weren't just vandals or local troublemakers. They were organized with a specific purpose in mind. "Boss wants this wrapped up quick," Rex continued, pulling something from his truck. Jim's eyes narrowed as he recognized the distinctive shape of a bolt cutter. "No sense waiting. Let's cut the fence every quarter mile or so. See how long it takes him to round up his cattle when they're scattered all over the county." The other men pulled tools from their trucks, more bolt cutters, chains, and what looked like spray paint. They were settling in for a morning of systematic destruction. Jim watched as they began working their way along his fence line, documenting their movements, their patterns, the way they coordinated with each other. One of them, younger than the others, seemed nervous. "What if someone comes along?" Rex laughed, a harsh sound that carried across the morning air. "That's what these are for." He patted something under his jacket, and Jim didn't need to see it to know what he meant. The implied threat was clear. They were armed and prepared for confrontation. Jim felt Dakota shift restlessly behind him, responding to the tension in his body. He placed a calming hand on the horse's neck, his mind already racing through scenarios and options. The tactical part of his brain, the part he'd tried to keep dormant for the past 5 years, was already analyzing angles of approach, cover positions, potential choke points. But this wasn't a combat zone, and these men, despite their obvious criminal intentions, weren't enemy combatants. This was Thunder Valley, where problems were supposed to be solved through civil channels. Jim had promised himself when he bought this ranch that he'd leave violence behind, that he'd find peaceful solutions to whatever challenges arose. As if to test that resolve, one of the men pulled out a can of spray paint and began writing on the nearest fence post. Even from his position, Jim could make out the crude threat being spelled out: "Sell or suffer." The morning sun continued to rise over Thunder Valley as Jim watched the men work their way along his fence line, methodically, destroying the boundary he'd so carefully maintained. Every cut of the wire, every toppled post, every spray-painted threat was a direct challenge to the peace he'd built here. But more than that, it was a warning of things to come. Jim waited until the trucks had moved further down the fence line, before quietly mounting Dakota and turning back toward the ranch house. He had calls to make, starting with Sheriff Wilson. But as he rode, a part of him knew that law enforcement might not be enough to handle what was coming. These men, whoever they were working for, hadn't chosen his ranch at random. They were organized, funded, and clearly used to operating without fear of consequences. The peace of Thunder Valley was about to be tested, and with it, Jim's resolve to keep his past firmly in the past. Sheriff Dave Wilson stood at the damaged fence line, his weathered face creased with concern as he surveyed the destruction. The morning was giving way to afternoon, and the spring sun cast long shadows across the trampled grass where the thugs had done their work. Jim stood beside him, his expression carefully neutral, as he watched the sheriff document the damage. "With his camera, never seen anything quite like this in Thunder Valley," Dave said, crouching to examine one of the spray-painted threats. "This isn't random vandalism, Jim. These boys came prepared, knew exactly what they were doing." Jim nodded, his hands resting on his belt as his eyes scanned the horizon. 4 men, 2 trucks. Their leader goes by Rex, red hair, beard, about 6'2". They're working for someone who's got an issue with my cattle prices. The sheriff looked up sharply. You saw them? Observed them from the tree line, Jim replied, his voice matter of fact. They weren't exactly being subtle about their intentions. Dave stood, brushing dirt from his knees. Why didn't you confront them? Call it in while it was happening? Jim's eyes met the sheriff's. Wouldn't have ended well. They were armed, Dave, and looking for an excuse. The implied violence in that statement hung between them. Dave had been sheriff long enough to read between the lines, to understand what Jim wasn't saying. He'd also been around long enough to recognize when something bigger was brewing. This feels organized, Dave said, walking along the fence line. Too professional for local troublemakers. You got any idea who might be behind it? Jim's jaw tightened slightly. Been hearing rumors about a new outfit buying up ranches in the next county, Maxwell Holdings. They've been pressuring smaller operations to sell using various tactics. Maxwell Holdings, Dave repeated, pulling out his notebook. They've come up in some conversations with other sheriffs. Nothing concrete, but there's been talk of similar incidents. Pressure tactics, vandalism, mysterious accidents. The wind picked up, carrying with it the sweet scent of spring grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Jim's herd had been agitated. All morning, sensing the tension in the air, Marcus and the other hands were out reinforcing the remaining fence lines. But Jim knew it was only a temporary solution. I'll increase patrols in the area, Dave offered, closing his notebook. Maybe station a deputy nearby at night, but Jim, he paused, choosing his words carefully. If these people are who I think they are, they're not going to be scared off by a few extra patrol cars. I know, Jim replied simply. Dave studied him for a moment. Look, I've got some contacts in the FBI field office in Helena. Might be worth getting them involved, especially if this is part of a larger pattern of organized intimidation. But Jim was already shaking his head. That'll take time we don't have, Dave. These men, they're not going to wait for federal investigations and warrants. They'll escalate things first. Then what's your plan? Dave asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Jim turned to face him fully. I'm going to handle it. Jim. Dave's voice carried a note of warning. Whatever. You're thinking, whatever skills you might have from your previous career. This isn't that kind of situation. Not yet. No, Jim agreed. But it will be. Men like this, they follow a pattern. First it's property damage, then threats. When that doesn't work, they'll target the livestock. And when that fails, he left the sentence unfinished. Dave sighed heavily. Just promise me you'll call if things get out of hand. Don't try to handle this alone. Jim nodded, but they both knew it was a promise he might not keep. As the sheriff drove away, kicking up dust on the ranch road, Jim remained at the fence line, his mind working through scenarios and possibilities. The tactical part of his brain, the part he'd tried so hard to suppress, was already cataloging vulnerabilities, identifying defensive positions, planning countermeasures. Marcus rode up as the sheriff's car disappeared around the bend. Got the south fence reinforced, boss. Tommy and Jake are working on the west section now. He paused, noting Jim's expression. What did the sheriff say? About what you'd expect, Jim replied. He'll increase patrols, file reports, standard procedure. Marcus shifted in his saddle. That's not going to be enough, is it? Jim turned to look at his head ranch hand, seeing the concern in the younger man's face. Marcus was good people, loyal and hardworking. He didn't deserve to be caught up in whatever was coming. Marcus, I want you and the other hands to take some time off. Paid leave, starting tomorrow. Boss, we can't just leave you to handle this. Alone. This isn't a request, Jim cut him off, his voice firm but not unkind. What's coming? It's not something you need to be involved in. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. Something in Jim's tone, or maybe his stance, made the young rancher realize this wasn't an argument he was going to win. He'd always known there was more to his boss than met the eye, and now he was seeing glimpses of whatever lay beneath the quiet rancher's exterior. "At least let me help you set up some security measures before we go," Marcus offered. "Cameras, lights, whatever you need." Jim considered this for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but you're out of here by sunset. All of you." As Marcus rode off to inform the other hands, Jim turned back to survey his property. The ranch spread out before him, peaceful in the afternoon light. But he knew that peace was an illusion now. The men who damaged his fence would be back, and next time they wouldn't just be sending a message. He'd tried so hard to leave his past behind, to build something pure and honest in this quiet valley. But sometimes the past didn't stay buried, and the skills you tried to forget became the very things you needed to survive. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Jim Cooper began to prepare for war. The next 3 days passed without incident, but the tension in the air grew thicker with each sunset. Jim spent his time preparing, though few would have noticed anything different about his daily routine. He still made his rounds, tended to his cattle, and appeared at the diner each morning for coffee. But beneath the surface, changes were taking place. He'd positioned motion sensors at strategic points around the property, their presence carefully concealed in natural features of the landscape. Security cameras, disguised as bird houses and weather stations, now covered every approach to the ranch. Jim had learned long ago that information was often the best weapon you could have. Sarah noticed the difference in him when he came in for his usual morning coffee. The way he carried himself had shifted subtly, his movements more measured, his awareness more acute. It reminded her of the way Michael had been before deployments, that heightened state of readiness that soldiers developed when they knew something was coming. "Everything all right out at the ranch?" she asked, topping off his cup. The morning sun had barely crested the eastern mountains, and the diner was empty except for them. Jim took a slow sip of coffee before responding. "Just some fence problems. Nothing I can't handle." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. She'd heard whispers around town about troublemakers, about damage being done to ranches in the area. "You know, Jim, sometimes handling things alone isn't the best way. The community here, we look out for each other." He met her gaze, seeing the genuine concern there. "I appreciate that, Sarah. But this isn't something the community needs to worry about." She recognized the tone, the gentle but firm way he was drawing a line. It was the same way Michael used to shut down conversations about his work, about the things he couldn't or wouldn't discuss. Sarah wanted to press further, but years of experience had taught her when to step back. "Just be careful," she said finally, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder before moving away to attend to other morning tasks. Back at the ranch, Jim had begun implementing other changes. He'd moved his most valuable breeding stock to the back pastures, far from the main road. The barn now housed more than just ranch equipment. He'd converted part of it into a command center of sorts, with monitors showing feeds from his newly installed cameras. At night, after ensuring everything was secure, he would sit in the barn watching the screens, remembering skills he'd hoped never to need again. His hands would automatically clean weapons that hadn't seen use in years, muscle memory taking over as his mind processed tactical scenarios. The sound of approaching vehicles would snap him to attention, but it was always just passing traffic on the county road. Still, each time he heard engines, his hand would instinctively move to his hip, where a familiar weight now rested beneath his jacket. One evening, as the sun was setting, he received an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Wilson's patrol car pulled up to the ranch house, dust settling around it in the golden light. Dave stepped out, his expression grave. "Got some news you need to hear," Dave said without preamble, as Jim met him on the porch. "Maxwell Holdings made their move official today. They've filed paperwork to purchase the Anderson place down the road. Old man Anderson sold after his barn mysteriously caught fire last week. Jim's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened slightly. How many does that make? 4 ranches in the last month, all after similar accidents or incidents of vandalism. Dave leaned against the porch railing. They're working their way through the valley, Jim, and they're getting more aggressive with each purchase. They're creating a pattern, Jim observed, quietly, making examples of those who resist, showing others what happens if they don't sell. Dave nodded. FBI's finally taking notice, but their investigation is moving slow. Too slow to help anyone who's being pressured now. He paused, studying Jim's face. I know you've got something planned. I can see it in the way you're carrying yourself these days. Just remember you're not in that world anymore. This is Thunder Valley, not some war zone. Jim's reply was soft but firm. Sometimes the war zone comes to you, Dave, whether you want it or not. The sheriff sighed heavily. At least let me help. I can't officially endorse whatever you're planning, but I can make sure my patrols are focused elsewhere when things happen. Better if you don't know anything, Jim replied. Plausible deniability. Dave straightened up, adjusting his gun belt. Just remember, these aren't insurgents or enemy combatants. They're criminals, yes, but this is still civilian territory. Rules of engagement are different here. Jim's slight smile didn't reach his eyes. Rules of engagement always depend on who's making the first move, Dave. You know that as well as I do. As the sheriff drove away, Jim returned to his evening routine. He checked the security feeds, made his rounds of the property, and ensured everything was locked down for the night. But there was a new energy in his movements now, a focused intensity that hadn't been there before. In his bedroom, he opened the locked drawer that contained his past. The medals and photographs remained untouched, but the space where certain other items had been stored was now empty. Some skills, like the ability to cache weapons and supplies, never really went away. They just went dormant, waiting for the moment they'd be needed again. Jim knew the thugs would return. Men like that always did. They'd come back stronger, more aggressive, thinking they could intimidate a simple rancher into submission. They had no way of knowing that the quiet man they were targeting had spent years in places where intimidation was an art form, where survival depended on being able to outthink and outmaneuver those who meant you harm. As night settled over Thunder Valley, Jim Cooper stood on his porch, watching the stars emerge. To anyone passing by, he would have looked like any other rancher ending his day. But beneath that peaceful exterior, calculations were being made, strategies formed, and plans set in motion. The war zone might have come to Thunder Valley, but it was about to find out that it had chosen the wrong rancher to threaten. The first real test of Jim's preparations came 3 nights later. He was in the barn, monitoring the security feeds, when movement caught his attention. 3 sets of headlights appeared on the access road, moving slowly with their lights dimmed. The vehicles were different this time, not the flashy pickup trucks from before, but darker, more nondescript models, better suited for night operations. Jim watched through the monitors as the vehicles split up, taking positions around different sections of his property. They were being more tactical this time, more organized. He counted 8 men total, all dressed in dark clothing, moving with purpose toward his cattle pens. This wasn't going to be simple vandalism. They were after his livestock. His hand moved instinctively to check his sidearm as he switched between camera feeds, tracking their movements. They'd chosen their timing well. A moonless night with cloud cover that made visibility poor, but they hadn't counted on the infrared cameras he'd installed or the motion sensors that were now silently mapping their every move. "Let's see what you're really after," Jim muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper in the dark barn. He switched to the feed covering the main cattle pen, where his prize-breeding bulls were kept. The infrared showed 4 men approaching. The gait, carrying what looked like cattle prods and tranquilizer guns. This wasn't a random attack. They knew exactly what they were targeting. Rex's voice carried clearly through the night air, picked up by the directional microphones Jim had positioned. "Remember, boss wants the 2 prize bulls. Anything happens to them, it's our heads. The rest we scatter, make it look like they broke through the fence themselves." Jim's jaw tightened. Those bulls represented years of careful breeding, the foundation of his herd's genetic line. Their loss would cripple his operation more effectively than any amount of fence cutting. He watched as the men began working on the gate lock, their movements precise and practiced. Another group was heading toward the barn, toward him. Jim moved silently through the shadows to a position he'd prepared earlier, where he could observe without being seen. Years of operating in hostile territory had taught him the value of letting your enemy show their hand before revealing your own. The barn door creaked open, and 2 men entered, flashlights sweeping the interior. Jim remained perfectly still, his breathing controlled, as the beams of light passed near his position. These men moved differently from the others. They had training, probably military or law enforcement background. This operation was more professional than he'd anticipated. "Clear the upper level," one of them whispered. "Cooper's truck is here. He's got to be around somewhere." Jim watched them move through the barn, noting their patterns, their blind spots. They were good, but they were used to dealing with ordinary ranchers, not someone who'd spent years learning how to turn terrain to his advantage. The barn's layout, which seemed simple and straightforward, was actually a carefully crafted maze of sight lines and choke points. Outside, he could hear the cattle beginning to stir, sensing the presence of strangers. A low, worried lowing started to spread through the herd. Through his earpiece, connected to the exterior microphones, he could hear Rex cursing as the animals began to move restlessly, making their job more difficult. "Trank the big ones," Rex ordered. "We don't have time for this to get messy." That was all Jim needed to hear. They were about to start drugging his cattle, a direct threat not just to his livelihood, but to the animals themselves. He'd seen enough tranquilizer accidents in his time to know how badly this could go wrong. Moving like a shadow, Jim positioned himself near the barn's rear exit. The 2 men searching inside were still on the upper level, and the others were focused on the cattle. It was time to even the odds. He clicked a small remote in his pocket, and suddenly the ranch's exterior lights blazed to life, flooding the yard with harsh white light. The effect was immediate. Shouts of surprise and confusion erupted from the men near the cattle pens. The 2 in the barn rushed to the upper windows, momentarily blinded and disoriented. Jim moved. Years of training took over as he flowed through the shadows, his footsteps silent on the barn floor. The first man never saw him coming. A quick strike to the back of the neck, and he was down. The second turned at the sound of his partner falling, but Jim was already there. A short, controlled sequence of movements, and the second man joined his companion on the floor. Outside, the chaos was growing. The cattle, startled by the sudden light, were beginning to panic. The sound of their movement covered Jim's exit from the barn as he moved toward the pens. Rex and his men were struggling to maintain control of the situation, their careful plan dissolving into disorder. "Find Cooper!" Rex shouted, his voice tight with anger. "He has to be out here somewhere!" Jim moved through the shadows at the edge of the light, using the years of training that had kept him alive in far more dangerous situations. He could disable these men. He had the skills and the opportunity. But that would escalate things beyond a point of no return. Sometimes he knew the best victory was letting your enemy realize they'd chosen the wrong target. Instead, he triggered his second surprise. The sprinkler system he'd modified came to life, but instead of water, it sprayed a mixture he'd prepared. Earlier, a combination of livestock marking dye and a powerful livestock-grade irritant, non-lethal but extremely effective at creating confusion and discomfort. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The men stumbled back, coughing and cursing, their dark clothes now stained with bright marking dye that would take weeks to fade. Even through their confusion, they'd realized later that they'd been marked, tagged like the very cattle they'd tried to steal. "Fall back!" Rex's voice cracked with fury and fear. "Fall back now!" Jim watched from the shadows as the men retreated to their vehicles, leaving behind their equipment in their haste to escape. He kept his position until the last tail lights disappeared down the access road, then began methodically checking his property and calming his cattle. The night's events had sent a message, but Jim knew it wasn't over. He'd shown them that he wasn't an easy target, that he was prepared and capable of defending his ranch. But men like Rex, men who used intimidation and force to get their way, wouldn't take this humiliation lightly. They would be back, and next. They wouldn't underestimate him. As he secured the unconscious men in his barn to wait for Sheriff Wilson, Jim began preparing for what he knew would come next. The real battle for Thunder Valley was just beginning. The morning after the incident found Jim at his usual spot in Sarah's diner, though earlier than normal. The sun hadn't yet crested the mountains when he pushed through the door, the bell's gentle chime announcing his arrival. Sarah looked up from where she was preparing for the day, immediately noting the tension in his shoulders, the alertness in his stance. "You look like you had a long night," she said, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Heard some commotion. Out by your place, lots of vehicles moving fast on the access road around midnight." Jim settled onto his usual stool, his movements measured and controlled. "Had some unwanted visitors. Sheriff's dealing with 2 of them now." Sarah's hand paused as she set the coffee cup in front of him. "2 of them? Jim, what's really going on out there?" Before he could answer, the diner's door opened again. "Sheriff." Dave Wilson stepped in, looking like he hadn't slept at all. His uniform was wrinkled, and his expression was grim as he took the seat next to Jim. "Well," Dave said, accepting the coffee Sarah quickly provided, "our 2 guests are singing like birds. Turns out they're ex-military private security contractors hired by Maxwell Holdings. They've given us enough to start building a real case." Jim took a slow sip of his coffee. "They won't be the last." "No," Dave agreed, "they won't. But you already knew that, didn't you? That's why you let them live, why you handled it the way you did." Sarah moved closer, her voice dropping. "What exactly happened last night?" Dave glanced at Jim, who gave a slight nod. "Our friend here gave Maxwell's crew a lesson in tactical humiliation. Caught 2 of their best men, marked the rest with livestock dye. They'll be walking around looking like Easter eggs for weeks." Despite the seriousness of the situation, Sarah couldn't suppress a small smile. "Livestock dye? That's creative." "It's also a message," Jim said quietly. "They want to play ranch games, they'll get ranch solutions, but they're not going to like where this ends up." The sheriff's expression grew serious again. "Jim, they're going to retaliate. Men like that, with their kind of backing, they can't afford to let this go. You embarrassed them, made them look amateur. They'll come back harder." "I'm counting on it," Jim replied, his voice carrying an edge that made both Sarah and Dave exchange concerned glances. Sarah leaned on the counter, her face showing the worry she couldn't hide. "Jim, these people, they've hurt other ranchers, destroyed livelihoods. The Anderson place, that fire wasn't an accident. Everyone knows it, even if they can't prove it." "I'm not other ranchers," Jim stated simply, but there was weight behind his words, a quiet confidence that spoke of experience with far worse situations. Dave set his coffee cup down with more force than necessary. "No, you're not. And that's exactly what worries me. I've seen your file, Jim, or what's left of it after all the redactions. I know what you're capable of, but this isn't some foreign operation. This is Thunder Valley." This stopped being just about Thunder Valley the moment they decided to target my ranch. Jim responded, his voice still calm, but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "They're using paramilitary tactics, hired ex-military contractors. They've escalated this beyond simple ranch disputes." Sarah's hand found Jim's arm, her touch gentle but insistent. "Then let the authorities handle it. Dave says they have evidence now. Evidence that'll take months to process," Jim cut in. "Investigations that'll drag on while more ranches get pressured into selling, while more accidents happen. How many more Andersons will lose everything while the system works?" The morning light was starting to fill the diner, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. The first regular customers would be arriving soon, ending their private conversation. Dave stood, adjusting his gun belt. "Just remember what we talked about. Rules of engagement. I can't officially know about anything you're planning, but unofficially—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Unofficially, I know sometimes justice needs a little help moving faster." After the sheriff left, Sarah lingered near Jim, refilling his coffee though the cup was still half full. "You know, Michael used to get this same look right before things would get dangerous. He'd try to handle everything alone, protect everyone else by taking all the risk himself." Jim met her gaze, seeing the understanding there, the mixture of concern and resignation. "How did that work out?" "It got him killed," she said softly. "He was so focused on protecting everyone else, he forgot he wasn't invincible." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Jim's expression softened slightly. "I'm not planning on dying, Sarah." "No one ever is," she replied. "Just remember you're not alone here. Thunder Valley takes care of its own." Jim nodded, finishing his coffee and standing to leave. As he reached for his wallet, Sarah waved him off. "On the house. Consider it community support for whatever comes next." Outside, the morning was fully underway. Ranchers and townspeople were starting their days, going about their routines as if nothing had changed. But Jim knew better. The peace of Thunder Valley had been disrupted, and it would take more than legal proceedings to restore it. As he drove back to his ranch, Jim's mind was already working through scenarios, planning countermeasures, preparing for the inevitable escalation. The thugs would be back, probably within days. They'd come with more men, better equipment, and wounded pride driving their actions. But this time they'd find more than just a simple rancher waiting for them. They'd discover that some skills never fade, that some men carry their combat experience, like a second skin, ready to be called upon when needed. The quiet rancher they dismissed as an easy target was about to become their worst nightmare. The war for Thunder Valley was about to enter a new phase, and Jim Cooper was ready to remind some people why Special Forces operators were considered among the most dangerous men in the world. The escalation came faster than even Jim had anticipated. 3 days after the night raid, he discovered his main water supply had been sabotaged. Someone had damaged the pumps that supplied his irrigation systems and cattle troughs, threatening not just his grass, but his herd's survival. The message was clear. They were done playing games. Jim stood by the damaged pump house, examining the deliberate nature of the destruction. They'd known exactly what they were doing, targeting critical infrastructure rather than just property. His jaw tightened as he noticed signs that they'd also introduced something into the water system, likely contamination to sicken his cattle. Marcus, who had refused to stay away despite Jim's warnings, approached on horseback. "Boss, we've got bigger problems. Just found 2 of the pregnant heifers dead in the north pasture. Looks like poisoning." The cold fury that swept through Jim was familiar, a sensation he hadn't felt since his last deployment. These men hadn't just crossed a line, they'd declared war. Killing innocent animals to prove a point was the kind of tactical error that changed the entire nature of a conflict. "Get Doc Stevens out here," Jim instructed, his voice carrying a deadly calm that made Marcus sit straighter in his saddle. Have him do a full toxicology workup. We need to know exactly what they used. Already called him, Marcus replied. But boss, what are we going to do about this? These guys, they're not just thugs anymore. This is systematic destruction. Jim's eyes scanned the horizon, noting the positions of the new cameras he'd installed after the night raid. Marcus, I need you to take the rest of the hands and get clear of the property. What's coming next? It's not something you want to be involved in. But that's an order, Jim cut him off, his tone brooking no argument. Take everyone and head into town. Stay there until you hear from me. Something in Jim's voice, or perhaps the way he stood, loose but ready, like a coiled spring, made Marcus swallow any further protest. He'd seen glimpses of this side of his boss before, but never so clearly as now. As Marcus rode off to gather the other ranch hands, Jim began implementing the next phase of his plan. He'd hoped it wouldn't come to this, had tried to handle things with measured responses, but they'd forced his hand by targeting innocent animals, by escalating beyond simple intimidation to actual destruction. The rest of the day was spent in careful preparation. Jim moved systematically through his property, setting up positions, preparing fallback points, establishing fields of fire. Anyone watching would have seen nothing more than a rancher going about his daily routine, checking fences and tending to cattle. But each movement had purpose, each pause was calculated. By sunset, the ranch had been transformed into something very different from its peaceful appearance. Motion sensors were linked to specialized equipment that would give him every advantage. When they returned, the barn, which looked unchanged from the outside, now contained a command center that would have impressed his old Special Forces teammates. As darkness fell, Jim received an expected visit. Sheriff Wilson's patrol car pulled up to the ranch house, lights off. Dave stepped out, his expression grave in the gathering dusk. "Got the preliminary report from Doc Stevens," Dave said without preamble. "The poison they used, it's military grade, not something you pick up at the local feed store." Jim nodded, having already suspected as much. "They're escalating, trying to force a confrontation." "Jim," Dave's voice carried a note of warning, "whatever you're planning, this is your last chance to let me handle this officially. We've got evidence now, real evidence. The FBI's involved. And how many more animals will die while the investigation runs its course?" Jim asked quietly. "How many more ranchers will lose everything?" "No, Dave. Sometimes you have to solve problems directly." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "You're certain they'll come back?" "Tonight," Jim confirmed. "They'll have monitored the property, seen the ranch hands leaving. They'll think I'm isolated, vulnerable. They'll want to finish this before their poison evidence can be processed." Dave's hand instinctively moved to his service weapon. "I should stay. Provide official backup." "Better if you don't," Jim replied. "Plausible deniability, remember? Just make sure your patrols are elsewhere tonight." As the sheriff drove away, Jim began his final preparations. He moved through the house and barn, checking his equipment one last time. Each piece had been carefully chosen and positioned, drawing on years of experience in asymmetric warfare. The sun had fully set when his perimeter sensors picked up the first movement. Multiple vehicles approaching from different directions, using back roads and unlit paths. They were being more cautious this time, more professional in their approach. Jim watched through his monitors as they established positions around his property. He counted 12 men, all moving with military precision. They'd brought better equipment this time, night vision gear, tactical communications, proper weapons. This wasn't going to be like the last raid. His hand moved to check his own gear. One final time, muscle memory from countless operations taking over. The weight of his tactical vest felt familiar, almost comfortable. The night vision monocle he'd mounted on his hatband gave him a clear view of the approaching threats. Rex's voice crackled through Jim's directional microphones, giving final instructions to his men. "No mistakes this time. Cooper's made his choice. We finish this tonight." Jim allowed himself a grim smile as he watched them begin their approach. They thought they were hunting a simple rancher, someone they could intimidate or eliminate. Instead, they were about to learn why special forces operators were considered the most dangerous adversaries you could face. "Come on then," he whispered to himself, moving to his first prepared position. "Let's remind you boys what real combat looks like." The war for Thunder Valley was about to reach its climax, and Jim Cooper was finally ready to show these men exactly who they'd chosen to target. The night air was thick with tension as Rex's team moved through the darkness, their night vision equipment giving them a false sense of security. What they couldn't know was that Jim had spent years operating in conditions far worse than this, against enemies far more skilled than they could imagine. Jim watched through his own advanced optics as they split into 3 teams, moving to surround the main house and barn. Their formation was textbook military, suggesting they'd done this before, but they were making a crucial mistake. They were fighting on his territory, in an environment he'd spent days preparing for exactly this moment. The first team approached, the house from the east, using the shadows of the old oak trees for cover. Jim had anticipated this approach, having used similar tactics himself in countless operations. He waited until they were fully committed to their advance before triggering his first countermeasure. A series of powerful LED floods suddenly illuminated the area, but these weren't ordinary lights. They were strobing at a specific frequency, one that played havoc with night vision equipment. The effect was immediate. 4 men stumbled, ripping off their now useless goggles, temporarily blinded and disoriented. "Contact east!" one of them shouted. But their tactical communication was already compromised. Jim had set up signal jammers, another trick learned from his special forces days. Their radio calls deteriorated into static. Rex's voice cut through. The chaos. "Push forward! He's just one man." That assumption was their second mistake. Jim moved silently through the shadows, his movements fluid and practiced. The first team was still recovering from the lighting attack when he struck. Years of close-quarters combat training took over as he engaged them with precise, controlled movements. He didn't need to kill them. That would only complicate matters. Instead, he employed the same techniques he'd used countless times to subdue, and targets without permanent injury. The first man went down with a precise strike to a nerve cluster. The second caught in a chokehold that rendered him unconscious in seconds. The remaining 2 opened fire, their shots wild and unfocused. But Jim had already moved, using the pre-planned routes he'd memorized through his property. Their bullets found nothing but empty air as he seemed to disappear into the darkness. "Where is he?" one of them shouted, panic edging into his voice. "How is he doing this?" The second team, hearing the commotion, tried to move to support their companions. But they triggered another of Jim's preparations, a series of cattle gates he'd rigged to create a makeshift maze. In the darkness, with their coordination disrupted, they found themselves channeled exactly where he wanted them. Jim's voice, when it came, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, another psychological tactic he'd learned in special forces. Last chance to walk away. Next phase gets considerably less pleasant. Rex's response was predictable. More gunfire, more shouted orders. But Jim could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. This wasn't going according to their plan. They were used to intimidating ordinary ranchers, not facing someone who turned their own tactics against them. The third team tried to flank the barn, looking to establish a secure position. Instead, they found themselves dealing with panicked cattle. Jim had intentionally agitated his herd earlier, knowing how the animals would react to strangers in their territory. The resulting chaos further disrupted their coordinated assault. Jim moved again, this time engaging the second team directly. His movements were economical, precise, no wasted energy, no flashy techniques, just the brutal efficiency that had been drilled into him through years of special operations training. One man went down to a swept leg and precise strike to the solar plexus. Another found himself disarmed before he could bring his weapon to bear. his own momentum used against him in a move that left him sprawled in the dirt, gasping for air. "What the hell is this guy?" someone shouted, their professional demeanor cracking under the pressure of facing an opponent they couldn't seem to pin down or predict. Rex, realizing his carefully planned operation was falling apart, tried to rally his remaining men. "He's just one rancher. Push forward, damn it!" Jim's voice carried across the darkness again, calm and controlled. "I'm not just a rancher, Rex. Your intelligence was incomplete. Special Forces 4th Group. You should have done better research before targeting this property." The effect of those words was immediate. Jim could see the remaining men exchanging glances, their confidence shattered. They'd come expecting to intimidate or eliminate a simple rancher. Instead, they'd walked into an engagement with someone far more dangerous than they'd imagined. Through his night vision, Jim watched as the realization spread through their ranks. Some of them had clearly served. They understood exactly what it meant to face a Special Forces operator on terrain he'd prepared. This wasn't just another ranch job gone wrong. This was rapidly becoming a survival situation. "Fall back," Rex ordered. But his command came too late. Jim had already moved to cut off their escape routes, using the same channeling techniques he'd employed countless times in combat zones around the world. The night erupted into chaos as Jim systematically dismantled their remaining resistance. Each move was calculated, each strike precise. He used their own tactics against them, the confusion, the darkness, the fear of an unseen opponent. One by one, Rex's men found themselves outmaneuvered and subdued. Some tried to fight back, only to discover that their combat training was woefully inadequate against someone who had spent years perfecting the art of close-quarters engagement. Others attempted to flee, only to find their escape routes blocked or compromised. Through it all, Jim maintained absolute control of the situation. This wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about sending a message. He could have killed them multiple times over, but that wasn't the point. The point was to show them, and whoever they worked for, that they had severely underestimated their target. As the last of Rex's team went down, Jim allowed himself a moment to survey the scene. The night had fallen silent again, broken only by the sound of labored breathing from the subdued attackers and the distant lowing of cattle. The message had been delivered, written in bruises and wounded pride rather than blood. Thunder Valleys. Peace had been defended, not through murder or excessive violence, but through the skilled application of force by someone who understood exactly how much was necessary and how much was too much. Sheriff Dave Wilson arrived at Thunder Valley Ranch just as the first hints of dawn were breaking over the eastern mountains. The scene that greeted him looked more like the aftermath of a military operation than a ranch dispute. Rex and his men were zip-tied and sitting in neat rows near the barn, most of them bearing the marks of close combat encounters. None appeared seriously injured, but their expressions showed a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Quite a night," Dave commented as Jim emerged from the shadows. The rancher looked remarkably composed for someone who just single-handedly defeated 12 armed men. "Want to tell me what happened here?" "They made some poor decisions," Jim replied simply, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had dealt with far worse situations. "Tried to press their advantage. It didn't work out for them." Dave surveyed the captured men, noting the quality of their tactical gear and weapons. "This is going to require quite a bit of paperwork. Mind filling me in on the details before the FBI shows up?" Jim nodded toward Rex, who sat apart from his men, his face a mask of barely contained rage. Their leader there made the mistake of thinking numbers and equipment would be enough. They weren't prepared for someone with actual combat experience. "From what I'm seeing," Dave said, walking among the subdued attackers, "these boys aren't exactly amateurs themselves. Got some pretty serious hardware here. Being a contractor isn't the same as being Special Forces," Jim responded. They're used to intimidating civilians. Different story when the target can fight back. One of the captured men spoke up, his voice carrying a mix of respect and fear. "You're insane, man. We had you outnumbered 4-1. Had night vision, tactical comms, everything." Jim turned to face him. "You had equipment, I had experience. Numbers don't mean much when you don't know how to use them properly." Sarah's truck pulled up the drive, dust billowing behind it. She stepped out, carrying several thermoses of coffee. Her eyes widened at the scene before her, but she showed no real surprise. Something in her expression suggested she'd expected something like this. "Thought you boys might need some coffee," she said, handing a thermos to Dave. "Figured it might be a long morning." Jim accepted a cup with a nod of thanks. "You didn't have to come out here, Sarah." "Yes, I did," she replied firmly. "Someone needs to make sure you're actually all right, not just pretending to be." Dave was examining the various non-lethal traps and devices Jim had set up around the property. "This is impressive work. Haven't seen anything like it since my military days." "Yes, I did," she replied firmly. "Someone needs to make sure you're actually all right, not just pretending to be." Dave was examining the various non-lethal traps and devices Jim had set up around the property. "This is impressive work. Haven't seen anything like it since my military days." "Standard counterinsurgency techniques," Jim explained, "modified for the situation. Didn't want to kill anyone, just send a message." Sarah moved closer to Jim, her voice low. "And did they get the message?" "They will." Jim's eyes moved to Rex. "Their employer is about to learn that some ranchers aren't worth trying to intimidate." The sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention. FBI vehicles were coming up the drive, followed by several state police cars. The federal response Jim had been hoping to avoid had finally arrived. "This is going to get complicated," Dave sighed. "You ready for the questions that are coming?" Jim's expression didn't change. "Everything I did was in self-defense. They came, armed with intent to do harm. I defended my property using reasonable force." Sarah couldn't suppress a small laugh. "Reasonable force? Is that what we're calling it? Compared to what I could have done?" Jim's voice carried an edge that made even Dave glance at him sharply. "Yes, this was reasonable." The FBI agents approached, their expressions a mixture of confusion and professional interest as they took in the scene. Jim could read their body language. They weren't used to finding professional contractors subdued and zip-tied by a single. "Rancher, Mr. Cooper," the lead agent asked, showing his credentials. "I'm Agent Peterson. Mind telling us what happened here?" "These men attempted to raid my ranch," Jim replied calmly. "They've been causing trouble in the valley, pressuring ranchers to sell. Tonight they made the mistake of thinking they could force the issue." "And you subdued them? All of them? Alone?" The agent's skepticism was clear. "Check their equipment," Jim suggested. "Military-grade weapons, tactical gear. This wasn't a simple trespassing case. They came prepared for serious violence." The agent turned to examine the captured men and their gear more closely. His eyebrows rose as he recognized the quality of the equipment. "This is professional gear. You're saying you took on 12 armed men by yourself? Special Forces training doesn't go away just because you change careers," Jim said simply. Understanding dawned in the agent's eyes. He'd clearly dealt with former Special Operations personnel before. "We'll need detailed statements from everyone." This case just got a lot more interesting. As the FBI began processing the scene and taking statements, Sarah stood beside Jim, watching the sunrise over his property. "You knew it would end this way, didn't you? From the moment they first threatened your ranch." Jim's expression softened slightly. "I hoped it wouldn't, tried to give them chances to walk away. Some people only understand one language." "The language of force," Sarah nodded. "Michael used to say the same thing, but he also said the hardest part wasn't winning the fight, it was living with the victory afterward." Jim turned to look at her. "This isn't the end. Maxwell Holdings won't take this lying down. They'll try legal channels next, probably pressure from their corporate lawyers. But they won't try force again, Sarah stated confidently. Not after tonight. The word will spread. The quiet rancher in Thunder Valley isn't someone to be trifled with. Jim watched as Rex was led to an FBI vehicle, the man's earlier arrogance replaced by defeated anger. Sometimes peace has to be defended. Tonight just reminded some people of that fact. The morning sun continued to rise over Thunder Valley, painting the scene in shades of gold and amber. The ranch was still standing, its peace restored, though something fundamental had changed. The quiet rancher had revealed his true nature, and Thunder Valley would never quite see him the same way again. In the weeks that followed the night raid, life in Thunder Valley slowly returned to its usual rhythm, though not everything went back to the way it had been. The story of how a single rancher had outmaneuvered and subdued 12 armed men spread through the community like wildfire, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Jim found himself the subject of quiet respect and curiosity when he made his morning visits to Sarah's diner. People would nod in his direction. Some would even approach to express their gratitude for standing up to Maxwell Holdings. But they also gave him more space, their friendly greetings now tinged with a hint of awe and perhaps a touch of wariness. The legal aftermath unfolded exactly as Jim had predicted. Maxwell Holdings' lawyers descended on Thunder Valley with threats of lawsuits and legal action. But their position was weak. Their hired contractors had been caught red-handed, armed, and trespassing, with clear evidence of their previous attacks on the ranch. Jim sat in Sheriff Wilson's office, reviewing the latest developments with Dave and Agent Peterson. The FBI investigation had uncovered a pattern of similar intimidation tactics across 3 states, all tied back to Maxwell Holdings through various shell companies. The U.S. Attorney's Office is moving forward with RICO charges, Peterson explained, spreading documents across Dave's desk. Your case broke it open, Cooper. Once Rex and his men started talking, the whole operation began to unravel. Dave leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smile on his face. Amazing what a little humiliation will do to corporate tough guys. How's Rex enjoying federal custody? He's cooperating fully, Peterson replied. Turns out he's not nearly as loyal to his employers when facing serious federal time. The evidence he's providing goes way beyond Thunder Valley. Jim listened quietly, his expression neutral. And the other ranchers? The ones who were forced to sell? The federal investigation has frozen all Maxwell Holdings assets, Peterson assured him. There will be restitution, chances for the original owners to reclaim their properties if they want them. The meeting was interrupted by Sarah, who entered carrying a tray of coffee. She'd taken to providing regular coffee service to the sheriff's office during these strategy sessions, though everyone knew she was really there to keep an eye on Jim. "How's the ranch?" she asked, setting a cup in front of him. "Marcus and the hands settling back in?" Jim nodded. "Everything's getting back to normal. Cattle are calm again, fences repaired. Doc Stevens gave the all-clear on the water supply. Yesterday? Normal," Dave repeated with a slight chuckle, "if you can call it that. Pretty sure your definition of normal has changed for most folks around here, Jim." There was truth in that. The peaceful rancher image hadn't exactly been a lie. Jim did find genuine satisfaction in the quiet work of running his ranch. But now that his true capabilities had been revealed, there was no going back to being just another face in the community. Later that afternoon, Jim rode the fence line with Marcus, checking the repairs and discussing plans for the upcoming season. The young ranch hand had been quiet for most of the ride, clearly working up to saying something. "Boss," Marcus finally spoke, reining his horse to a stop. "I've been meaning to ask. All those times you taught us about ranch security, about being aware of our surroundings, that wasn't just ranching experience talking, was it?" Jim looked at his head ranch hand, seeing the mixture of respect and uncertainty in the younger man's eyes. No, it wasn't. Some skills translate well from one life to another. The way you handled those men. Marcus shook his head in amazement. I've never seen anything like it. The other hands, we've been talking. We always knew there was something different about you, but this changes things? Jim finished for him. Yeah, Marcus admitted, but in a good way, I think. Knowing you've got that kind of capability, that you could have used lethal force but chose not to, it means something. They rode in silence for a while. The only sounds the creak of leather and the steady rhythm of hooves on grass. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pastures, where Jim's cattle grazed peacefully, unaware of how close they'd come to being lost. You know, Marcus continued, some of the other ranchers have been asking if you'd be willing to teach them, not the fighting stuff necessarily, but the security aspects, how to protect their properties better. Jim considered this. He'd spent years trying to keep his past separate from his present, but maybe there was a middle ground. Might be worth discussing. Some basic security measures could benefit the whole valley. They finished their patrol as the sun was setting, the mountains turning purple against the darkening sky. Sarah was waiting on Jim's porch when they returned, a covered dish in her hands. Thought you might be hungry, she said as Jim dismounted. And I wanted to check how you're doing with all this, really doing, not just the face you show everyone else. Jim took care of his horse before joining her on the porch. The evening air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and prairie grass. I'm fine, Sarah. This isn't my first time dealing with aftermath. No, she agreed, but it's the first time you've had to deal with it here, in a community that knows you. That's different from being able to move on to the next mission. She was right, of course. In his Special Forces days, there was always another assignment, another location. You didn't have to live with the long-term consequences of your actions in quite the same way. The valley's changed, he acknowledged. People look at me differently now. They look at you with respect, Sarah corrected. Not just for what you did, but for how you did it. You protected more than just your ranch that night. You showed everyone that standing up to bullies is possible. The stars were beginning to appear, bright points of light in the darkening sky. Jim thought about how much had changed since he'd first bought this ranch, seeking peace and anonymity after years of combat. You know, Sarah said softly, Michael used to say that sometimes the hardest fights are the ones you have to stick around for afterward. But those are also the most important ones. Jim nodded, understanding the truth in those words. The night he'd defended his ranch hadn't just been about stopping thugs or protecting his property. It had been about defending a way of life, about showing that peace sometimes had to be fought for. Thunder Valley was different now, and so was he. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Sometimes the best way to honor peace was to be ready to defend it, and sometimes the strongest communities were the ones that knew exactly who was standing watch over them. A year after the night that changed, Thunder Valley, Jim Cooper stood on his porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. The ranch had flourished in the months following the confrontation with Maxwell Holdings, his cattle operation expanding as other ranchers sought to partner with him, trusting both his business acumen and his demonstrated ability to protect what mattered. The valley itself had transformed in subtle but significant ways. The weekly security workshops Jim had reluctantly agreed to host had evolved into something more, a community gathering where ranchers shared information, supported each other, and ensured that no outside force would ever again threaten their way of life. Sarah's truck pulled up the drive, dust trailing behind it in the evening light. She'd made these visits a regular occurrence, though they both knew she was checking on more than just his well-being. She carried a familiar covered dish as she climbed the porch steps. "Thought you might want some company," she said, setting the dish on the railing, And some of that meatloaf you pretend not to love. Jim's slight smile acknowledged the truth of her words. Pull up a chair. Marcus just reported the last of the new calves are doing well. They sat in comfortable silence, for a while watching the day fade into dusk. The peaceful scene before them was a far cry from the tension that had gripped the valley a year ago. The sprawling pastures, healthy cattle, and well-maintained fences stood as testament to what they'd protected. Heard from Agent Peterson today, Sarah mentioned, breaking the silence. The last of the Maxwell Holdings cases is wrapping up. Old man Anderson got his ranch back, with compensation for damages. Jim nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Good. That's what this was all about, making sure people could keep their homes, their way of life. Is it? Sarah asked, her voice gentle but probing. Or was it about finding your own peace, finally reconciling those two parts of yourself? The question hung in the air as Jim considered his response. The past year had forced him to confront the reality that his special forces background wasn't just something he could lock away. It had become an integral part of who he was, even in this peaceful valley. Maybe both, he finally answered. Can't always choose when your past becomes relevant, but you can choose how to use it. Down in the valley, lights were beginning to twinkle on in distant ranch houses. The community looked different to Jim. Now, not just as something to be protected, but as something he was truly part of. The barriers he'd maintained between his past and present had softened, allowing him to be more than just the quiet rancher or the skilled warrior. He could be both, and the valley was stronger for it. Marcus rode up, his horse's hooves crunching, on the gravel. Evening, boss. Sarah? He dismounted, his movements showing the confidence of a man who had grown into his role. Just finished the night check, everything's secure. The words carried more weight than they would have a year ago. The simple ranch hand had evolved into something more, learning from Jim's example how to be both a skilled rancher and a vigilant protector. Good work, Jim acknowledged. How are the new security cameras working out? Perfect, Marcus replied. Been teaching Tommy how to monitor them properly, like you showed us. Kid's got a natural eye for it. Sarah smiled at the exchange. The mentorship Jim provided now went beyond just ranching skills, though he was careful to maintain the balance between preparedness and paranoia. He taught his hands to be aware, to be capable, but never to lose sight of the peace they were protecting. You've built something special here, Sarah observed after Marcus had gone. Not just a ranch, but a community that knows how to stand together. Jim's gaze swept across his property, taking in the subtle security measures that were now integrated seamlessly into the ranch's operation. They weren't obvious unless you knew what to look for. Cameras disguised as birdhouses, motion sensors that looked like ordinary fence posts, carefully planned sightlines that appeared natural but provided tactical advantages. We all did, he corrected her. Every rancher who stood their ground, every person who refused to be intimidated. Even you, Sarah, keeping the heart of the community beating at that diner of yours. A cool evening breeze carried the scent of sage and prairie grass, mingling with the aroma of Sarah's meatloaf. The peaceful scene was a reminder of exactly what they'd fought to preserve. Michael would have approved, Sarah said softly, of how you handled everything, of what you've built here. He always said that the true measure of a warrior wasn't in how well he fought, but in what he chose to fight for. Jim nodded, understanding. The weight of her words. His time in Special Forces had taught him how to fight, but Thunder Valley had taught him what was worth fighting for. The peace he'd found here wasn't the empty quiet he'd initially sought, but something richer, a peace earned through strength, wisdom, and community. As night settled over the valley, the stars emerging like diamonds scattered across the darkening sky, Jim Cooper felt a deep sense of contentment. He was no longer trying to escape his past or hide who he was. Instead, he had found a way to use all of his experiences, all of his skills, to protect and nurture something truly valuable, The quiet rancher and the special forces operator had finally found their balance, not in isolation, but in service to a community that had become family. Thunder Valley was safer, stronger, and more united than ever before, and Jim Cooper had found his true purpose, not just as a guardian, but as a builder of something lasting and meaningful. The peace of Thunder Valley had been tested, defended, and ultimately strengthened, and in the end, that was worth every moment of the struggle, every challenge faced, and every secret revealed. The war for Thunder Valley had transformed into something more, a lasting legacy of strength, unity, and resilience that would endure for generations to come.